Hey, that'd be great. Okay. Great.
David? Or...
Secretary Young, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. Good afternoon, everybody. It is September 7th, 2021, and this meeting is the Vermont Climate Council Steering Committee and Subcommittee Co-Chairs meeting. We're meeting biannually, and today's agenda is full. We did not put the approval of the August 19 meeting minutes on the agenda folks received on Friday, so I'm just asking if folks have any objection to taking that up first, and then we'll go back to that. We're going to talk about the climate action drafting plan process that Lauren Oates and Chris Campany have talked with us about a couple of times. There's a discussion around the guidance for subcommittees that Jane is going to lead. David will talk about the Climate Council agenda, and we'll get some updates from Jane again around where we are with the just transition guiding principles and rubric and the engagement event schedule. And then we'll close up with David with a discussion about development process for steering committee meetings. And of course, then we'll take some public comment. So I'm going back to the 3 p.m. First agenda. It would be great if anybody would voice their objections to taking up the minutes. If you didn't have time to review them and don't feel comfortable doing that, we can certainly put that off till next week. I just didn't want them to fall by the wayside.
Yeah. Great. Okay, thanks, Secretary Young. That indeed, we've got a packed agenda. Any concerns about trying to approve minutes right now, even though we didn't initially link that when we first sent it out on Friday? Is that okay? Anybody concerned about that? Okay, great. I'm not seeing any concerns among steering committee members. Thanks. And so let's go ahead and do that as our first piece, as long as there aren't any quick questions about what we're actually trying to do today and the agenda that Secretary Young laid out. Any concerns we need to address right now before we get going? Okay. I'm not seeing any concerns. Okay, great. So let's do our usual, the minutes from our last meeting are hyperlinked into the version of the agenda that Jane put right into the chat on the website. It's right there. Just take a minute. Folks want to hyperlink in through. Make sure you have those handy. I do want to, while we're doing that, welcome all the members of subcommittees who I can see are on this call. We've got some co-chairs on this call, and this meeting is explicitly weaving in co-chairs and steering committee members. So thanks everybody for being here. But circling back to the minutes, any concerns with approving the minutes from last meeting? Any concerns people want to raise about those minutes, things that need to be adjusted before we treat them as approved? Anybody need more time? Okay, so I'm not hearing any concerns. I'm not seeing folks asking for more time. So let's consider those minutes to be approved. Thanks so much. That's great. And with that, we can move forward into our next piece, which is the climate action plan drafting process. And I can just set this up by saying this is something that's been talked about a couple meetings now. We pushed it back from last meeting to this meeting on the request of one of you all as steering committee members. And as you can see in the agenda, we're trying to be even more specific about what we want to happen and what we're asking for in terms of action coming out of each of these steps. So you'll see in the bolded part in the agenda there, what we want from the steering committee, you all today, is to review and approve this proposal with any revisions that you all consider important to do and mention right now. That's what we're asking. So what we want to do is have a conversation about it, and I'll leave it to Lauren and Chris, who have been most on top of the creation of this proposal. Again, it is hyperlinked in the agenda. And let's spend just a couple minutes, Lauren, Chris, if you want to walk us through the key pieces of this. And then let's talk about any concerns steering committee members have and how we want to address those concerns. So Lauren and Chris, let me turn it over to you for a moment to do that.
Lauren, you want to go? Want me to? Okay.
Sorry to not be more directive there.
Sorry. As has been discussed, as David noted, and has been discussed a few times, the idea was to define how counselors might be able to be engaged in the actual drafting of the climate action plan and defining kind of the parameters of what that might look like. The goal being to provide a vehicle for counselors to become involved, but also to provide that support to staff. And what we discussed was this would be a self-selected group of counselors who had the capacity, the time, and the interest to engage in this at the schedule that needs to be created. In other words, you got the time and the energy and effort to do it. And we discussed the proposal with Jane and Marianne, I believe, then also Leslie Ann, Dr. Dupuini Drew was involved in the drafting of this. There was a lot of back and forth. And I believe this was also reviewed at the request of the secretary. We gave more time for Secretary Moore to review the proposal. Some more edits were made, and what came out of that is what's before you now. So is that a good enough nutshell? And Jane, if you want to add anything to it, or Lauren?
Good. Okay. So it's a proposal to create this more formal process to incorporate counselors in the drafting process and supporting staff to do that. Okay. So let's have a quick conversation about concerns or things that we may think we need to change about this as we move to approve it and push it up to the full council. Jared, you want to go ahead?
Sure. Thanks, David. So I just first want to thank Chris and Lauren and Leslie Ann and Jane and Julie and anybody else who has spent time putting this together, because I really agree with and support the intent of making sure that we're fully taking advantage of the expertise and experience that many counselors have in plan writing and their desire to contribute. And I am generally supportive of this proposal, as I know Liz is, who I spoke with briefly before this meeting, even though she can't attend. I do want to raise a question to start, and then reserve the opportunity to raise a couple of potential concerns after I ask that question, if that's all right. And I apologize that I didn't raise this with Lauren or Chris or Leslie Ann or Jane or Julie before. I'm just reviewing this now for the first time today. So my first is a question on the first bullet point. And I wonder if one of the drafters can speak to the intended interpretation or meaning of the words at the end of that first, actually it's the first indented bullet point under coordinate writing of the CAP, specifically the language promote equal treatment of adaptation, mitigation, sequestration, and building resilience.
Does someone want to speak to that and why why that was called out in this draft? I think, Jared, you're talking about particularly the equal treatment comment that's in there.
Yeah, and if it's helpful for context, I can share a potential concern. It may not be relevant depending on what is meant by that.
Yeah, I can speak to that because I think it was probably my edit that had that brought into the outline, and just making sure that we have text and components within the plan itself that are trying to address and provide sort of strategies and actions around each of these sort of big areas of work, recognizing that all three are integral to delivering the climate action plan as described by the Global Warming Solutions Act. And I can't remember if it was that we had something, if there was something initially in there that sort of had one, but maybe not all three of those components, but just trying to be explicit that all three are important to the final work product.
Is there a specific concern, Jared, that you want to put out there about
Well, I
that
guess,
phrase?
and I hesitate to do so because I don't necessarily yet have a suggested alternate language, but maybe we can get there. I think the possible concern I have is twofold. One is, I'm thinking about this in the context of our kind of mutual recognition and our kind of shared attempt to address the situation that we have very clear, quantifiable requirements in terms of our mitigation targets. And we do not have that as much on the adaptation and resilience side. And so many of those subcommittees that are focused on those have been working to suggest possible goals and objectives that would be more quantifiable, more readily able to be tracked, and have a sense of whether we're meeting them. And I very much support that. I guess what I'm feeling is, there are certain parts of the Global Warming Solutions Act that I think can be read in different ways. But I think that I want to make sure that we're following the letter of the law and the intention of the law, and not doing too much to kind of put our own preferences on top of it. And what I mean by that is, for instance, including the language about sequestration. I agree that sequestration is very important. It's very important to meeting the net zero targets by 2050. But I think it's very clear in the beginning of the law that what we're talking about is gross emissions reductions, certainly by 2025 and 2030. And so while I think sequestration needs to be a very present and important piece in the climate action plan, how we measure it, how we improve that measurement, how we advance strategies to do so, I just don't want to overstep our bounds when we know that the initial targets that this plan is most focused on for 2025 and 2030 are about gross emissions reductions. And I think similarly, I want to make sure that in our attempt and in our responsibility to address adaptation and resilience, that does not become a way that we kind of take attention away from what is in the act, the very first thing listed, which is in the most present legally binding requirement, which is this has to add up to a plan that meets the emissions reduction, gross emissions reduction requirements. So that's why I ask about the equal treatment question.
Yeah, okay, great. So thanks for that concern. We're gonna have to, in this meeting, and this is me as your facilitator, being like, let's be super executive in this meeting if we can, because we got a lot to do. If that's a concern, is there something we can do quickly to address that concern, right? Can we just put something at the end of that phrase that says meeting all the requirements? So that, is there a way to address that concern in what's written? Richard, do you have a suggested pathway on how to address that?
Well, you just suggested it, frankly, and this is what I was going to suggest, something along the lines of recognizing that in this first plan, that, I'm sorry, I don't have the exact language, but language along the lines of recognizing that in, this first climate action plan, the plan must also meet the statutory requirements to reduce emissions by 2025 and 2030. by the statutorily designated amounts. That's awkward phrasing. I'm sure we can make it better, but I
The
agree
idea is there, yeah.
yeah, I agree with Jared's point. You know, and certainly from the point of view of the way the statute is written, if the plan doesn't meet those reduction requirements, that could be the source of litigation.
Sure.
And, you know, and that's quite explicit in the statute. We need to recognize that.
Excellent. Okay. So Secretary Moore, because this is something it's important to you, do you see that pulls it together to say they need treatment, we need to work on all three, we need to meet the statutory requirements and emissions reductions? Does that make sense as a pathway on this?
Yeah, I mean, there was no intention here to suggest that we wouldn't somehow meet the statutory obligations. And frankly, I think that this is a reflection also of the feedback we received from Representative Briglin when we were in front of House Energy and Technology 2 weeks ago. To acknowledge it, I think the concern is less about the emphasis that's needed on greenhouse gas emissions reductions and ensuring that we don't let the other things fall behind.
Right. So if that is rephrased to capture both ideas that we need to meet statutory requirements on emissions reductions, we also need to be putting front and center these other components of the Global Warming Solutions Act. Does that address everybody's concerns on this particular issue? And I see in the chat, Jared, you suggest promote substantial inclusion of instead of equal treatment. I mean, I'm not sure.
I just want to make sure that we're following the Global Warming Solutions Act and not taking too much liberty to. I guess one of the specific things that's concerning is equal treatment of sequestration, because right now the law is not written that way. The law is written that we have gross emissions reduction targets that we need to hit by 2025 and 2030. And I agree that we need to do more to measure and understand sequestration and pathways and strategies, and certainly around meeting our net zero targets. But right now, that's not the way the law is written. And so the idea of sequestration having equal treatment to gross emissions reduction strategies, I feel like would be an overstepping at this point.
Okay. Chris, a suggestion to get us out of this, because we really do need to find a pathway on this.
I think that's okay. I mean, maybe the work on elevating adaptation and building resilience is something we need to do in the legislature's next session. Chairman Briglin actually offered a mea culpa that it wasn't given equal billing in the original act. I can tell you in my work here, having gone through our biggest disaster since Irene on July 29th, and then dodging 3 potential direct hits of 3 other tropical storms, one in succession of another. In my world, we can go negative emissions tomorrow, and for everybody living in Vermont right now, we're still going to be dealing with the same issues. So I'm going to keep beating that drum. I'll also keep beating the drum on needing to reduce emissions. So, but that's my position, is I'm going to keep beating that drum because of fundamental life safety issues, existential issues, whether we reduce greenhouse gas emissions or not. But I can live with whatever.
Okay, super. Now, just in the interest of time, folks, I'm sensing that there is a fundamental thing underneath all this, but what's emerging is the importance that this plan address all these issues and recognize there's statutory requirements that need to be met, and that what we produce has to be able to meet those statutory requirements. Okay. I'm wondering if that's enough on this issue. We can rework it. It sounds like, Chris, you're happy to rework that. And so it reflects the conversation we just had right now. So when it goes up to the full council, it has some language that reflects what we just did. I see a bunch of hands. I would encourage us to think about getting beyond this particular issue. If there's any other concerns, to move into those. But if you need to say one more thing on this issue, let's go ahead and do that. Rich, is your hand for that?
Yeah, very quickly. I think equal is problematic as a legal term. I wouldn't use it. But I would recommend, and I agree with Chris, by the way, on the importance of resilience and adaptation. I bet you Jared and Chris could come up with a sentence that solves this problem.
That sounds great. And just to be clear, are the other steering committee members okay if Jared and Chris come up with a sentence that solves this problem? Is everybody okay with that happening? Any concerns about Jared and Chris solving this?
Lauren may have done it for us. So.
Okay, even better. And Laura might have already moved the ball on this. Okay, great.
I like what Lauren did as well.
Okay, so let's say that can be solved with some language that pulls from the spirit of this conversation. And Jared, is the hand about that? Can we put this one particular problem to bed? Is there something else you want to say before I go to Secretary Young?
Yes, there's just one other piece. I think it's very minor, but I'm happy to. It's different. It's a later section of the draft, so I'm happy to come back to it if Secretary Young's comment is on this point.
Okay, Secretary Young, you want to go ahead?
Be brief. I think that the exchange we just had, between Jared and Chris and the different perspectives. Yes, we have a law we need to follow, and that law contains a lot of things. And my concern may be alleviated with the language that comes up before the full council meeting. But I think it really underscores that not all things may be equal. But my underlying concern that the perception will be that a self-selected group of counselors will be driving this bus in a direction that they feel very strongly about and leaving other very important topics behind. That's my concern. And I think we just saw it play out, and we have to beat the drum on everything in this statute.
Okay. Thanks. And I wonder, Secretary Young, is there something specific you'd like to flag up in here that when it heads up to the council, you'd want to see either some change in this document or some sort of flag that you'd like to put based on that concern you just raised?
I have two things I'd like to see before this goes to the full council. One is transparency, understanding we are operating under the public records law as an executive and we're operating as an executive entity, that we have public records laws that we need to follow, and we have open meeting laws that we need to follow. That email exchanges could constitute an open meeting, that every draft is going to have to be maintained. All comments are going to have to be maintained to be in compliance with the public record law. So I really would like to see an acknowledgement that everybody's expectation around that is clear to follow the law, as Jared has pointed out we need to. That might come with some legal advice from general counsel, or it might just come from a process that comes out of this decision, or if there's consensus around this process that you're laying out. And then secondly, clarity on the timelines. If we're going to ask counselors next week to raise their hand and see if they want to self-select and be all in on drafting of this plan, what are they signing on for? What is the actual time commitment? When you talk about capacity, I think about that as, are you going to have time to write a section of a plan? And how many hours will that take? And how are we currently planning to get this done, and where they're going to fit in that time frame? I think we have to be fair to staff who have plans to write this, and we're adding another layer, and that's okay. But everybody's got to, who raises their hand, I think really has to be clear on those expectations. And then finally, clarity as to staff. There's just in my mind, just an inherent conflict in this document that state staff will be assigned by leadership, but further down that state staff will be selected by counselors. So those are just two things. I think if we have the transparency and we know who's writing the plan, and the executive who have to manage staff to do their day jobs as well, that there's just real expectations around that before it's presented to counselors to raise their hands to join in. That's all I'll
Thanks.
say.
That's really helpful. Okay. All right, so we've got these two things, the transparency issue and how we do this appropriately under a public meeting law, and clarity on timing of what we're going to say, what this really means for folks, and then also how that loops into the way staff are assigned and staff responsibilities. Okay. Erica, I see your hand up.
Actually, you just summarized my concern based on what Secretary Young just said. So I will yield my time.
Okay, thanks, Erica. But it's around the staff and the sort of organization of all that.
It's also concerns around writing a plan as a committee. Myself and several other folks that are on this meeting right now understand what it is to have to actually do plan drafting, and doing that by committee. And frankly, and I'm not detracting from the open meeting law here, but doing it in compliance with the open meeting law gives me heartburn, significant heartburn. So to the extent that we can clarify more about the process and how that can get accomplished, it will serve us well when the whole council meets and asks those questions.
Thanks, Erica. Okay, great. Jared, do you want to lay out the other things that are on your?
Yeah, it's one thing, and it may be very quick. It's the second to last, let's say left justified most bullet points. So it's the language is raise specific issues that require steering committee review and discussion, and just a friendly amendment that recognizing that when we created the steering committee, it was to exist in service to the council, and there may be some things that would be more appropriate for council review and discussion. So I would just suggest changing that to say raise specific issues that require steering committee and or council review and discussion, depending on what the issue is that gets raised.
Okay, great. Okay. All right. Secretary Moore, and then we'll take a stab at how we're going to deal with these concerns. Yep.
I wanted to suggest that I know Jane and Marion have put some time into thinking through what the schedule for themselves would be, assuming that we had moved forward with a staff draft for review and comment by the council. And I think having that shared with the full council for discussion at the next meeting is important. One of my biggest concerns, frankly, is accountability, I guess, for lack of a better word. And I mean that in the nicest possible way. I don't see how we as an agency have the ability to provide a plan B if there's a failure by volunteers to meet the deadlines that we've laid out. And I'm really concerned, given the incredibly aggressive schedule we have for developing the climate action plan, that there's no room for drop stitches. And just to maybe sort of pick up on some of what Erica said, but the more people involved in the process, in the initial drafting, not the review and comment, but that initial drafting, I think the more challenging it is to ensure that kind of collective accountability for ourselves, and timely delivery of a complete plan. And so just feel like, appreciate the holding off on this conversation till today so I could be part of it. But this accountability thing is something that's just been gnawing at the pit of my stomach, because whereas to the extent state staff are drafting the plan, there's an ability to sort of ensure and provide oversight for that work and timely drafts to the council for review and comment. To the extent others are engaged, it becomes much more complex. And I don't believe that I think we just have to go into it eyes wide open, that collectively we're going to succeed or fail in meeting our own deadlines.
Okay, great. All right, Erica, is that an old hand or a new hand?
Nope, just this had maybe raised, but I just wanted to offer this as a suggestion. It may be way too late in the game to bring on additional help in plan drafting, but that may be an option if there is somebody we know or folks on contract that are already available to assist with plan drafting, at least initial plan drafting.
Okay. Okay. All right. Lauren, I was going to turn to you in part
yeah.
because there's a number of concerns laid out on the table, and I wonder if there's anything you want to say about those as we think about pushing this thing up to the full council for consideration.
Well, I don't know that I have like a comprehensive suite of, I don't know, responses to the comments made. But I will say that, well, one, to Erica's point about hiring on support, the idea behind this was that there are people that are on the council currently who have the capacity, resources, and ability to support the writing itself. So I don't know that needing to hire it out makes much sense. To the point about state staff writing the plan, somewhere in there, maybe in a past iteration, there was the general idea that there could be potentially even a counselor and a staff person assigned to different sections so that there could be a team of two working on it, one counselor and one state staff person, which would theoretically build in the accountability structure if the counselor were not to be showing up in the way or time needed that the state staff person would or could. And just a general comment that it's really striking to me that this was brought up in July and we're in mid-September, and we've requested this be passed. We've gone back and edited it as recommended and requested by this group several times over. We're now into mid-September. I'm not even sure the utility of this group in supporting or adding capacity. And that I just still fundamentally believe that counselors should be involved in the drafting of the plan that we're supposed to be passing pursuant to the Global Warming Solutions Act. So that's all I have to say. I'm happy to make any additional edits as this group deems fit.
Thanks, Lauren. Thanks. Okay, Gina, want to say something real quick?
Yeah, from the perspective of the transportation group, you know, we're wrestling with policy specifics, the overall economic, emissions and program costs and benefits, funding sources, staffing needs. And we need help getting this information assembled and written down. And I'm not sure if what's laid out here will achieve that. Perhaps I'm missing something. You know, really what we need to do is develop our recommendations in some detail.
Yeah.
As well as
And just-
assemble everything together. So there's this, to me, this looks at assembling the whole thing. Maybe other groups' interest in this effort really know what they're going to do, and it's all very evident. We know what we're going to do, but we need to fill in a ton of details that we don't have the capacity to do. So who and how are we going to do that? Get into those policy details. Now, state staff could very well likely help, and the consultants will obviously help. But who else is going to be there to support us?
Yeah.
Just throwing that out there.
And that seems like, Gina, that's like the conversation at the subcommittee level and the task lead level about how you producing content that gets turned over to.
Well, there's a
drafting.
major drafting part. There's a major drafting component to that. It doesn't just appear. Someone's got to write it all up.
Yeah.
And it's going to need technical help doing that.
Okay. Okay. Chris?
Yeah, the only thing I was going to say in response to Secretary Moore's concerns, I absolutely get it. I mean, having drafted many plans and served many different commissions as staff, you know, my concern, one of the reasons why I was involved in helping suggest this was, and maybe it wouldn't work out this way, was that if it is primarily drafted by staff and then presented without counselor engagement, there's also the risk of then having something that would either result in gridlock or, you know, folk just not supporting what staff have done. Whereas if you have counselor involvement and kind of helping in the drafting, then you've got that mutual responsibility and that mutual accountability. So I absolutely get what you're saying and appreciate that. I'm just also, I would have concerns about it going the other way. And that's just something for you to be able to ponder.
Yeah. Okay, so I want to test something here, Richard. I mean, there's concerns being expressed. There's a sense that this needs to be popped up to the council level. And I guess what we need to do now as a steering committee is say, when we send this up to the, assuming everybody's okay sending it up to the council, we need to send it with these kinds of things that have come up in this meeting that are concerns that have been expressed. And so it sounds like we need to really lay out those concerns clearly, say people have different views on them, but there's things that have happened on the steering committee, and the council should be aware that that's a conversation that happened in the steering committee. So that's sort of where I'd like to go. I'm conscious of the time. There's other things we should do. Obviously, this is a really important thing, so we got to get this right. But Richard, and then Secretary Young, and then let's see how we do.
Well, I just wanted to follow up on the comments by both Chris and Gina. It seems to me that what we're looking for is a drafting work process that involves both state staff people and counselors in close cooperation. And I was sort of figuring from the cross-sector mitigation committee that our task leads would be working pretty closely with state staff on the drafting process, asking for certain sections to be written, asking for the data from the consultants to be integrated, supervising it, looking at drafts, et cetera. And that it would not be the case that state staff would be off by themselves writing, and it wouldn't be the case that counselors were taking the pen and trying to do everything. So it seems to me that the message we want that the steering committee should be sending, I agree with your point, David, that we need to tell the full council about the pros and cons of different approaches, but that we also ought to provide a procedural path that looks like it accommodates the large majority of everybody's concerns.
Okay. Yep. Secretary Young.
I think this is my opinion. If I were a council member who was being presented with this proposal next week, being asked whether, they thought this was a good idea and wished to proceed, I would want to know what's the alternative. What were we planning before this proposal came forward, and why is that now being? Why are we looking at this? And again, I think I heard Secretary Moore say that Jane and Marion have been working outside of this proposal to put together a drafting plan for staff. And the notion that counselors will not be involved in drafting, I guess, is one that I want to push back a little bit on. Anyone who's a secretary or a commissioner on this call knows the legislature tasks individual offices with the Secretary of Administration shall do this. And very rarely does the Secretary of Administration or the Secretary of A&R pick up the pen and actually write this report and submit it to the legislature. That is not to say there's not involvement, there's not editing, there's not consultation. It is to say this notion that the counselors, because of the language in the statute, have to pick up the pen and actually draft the plan is not really the reality of serving in these roles in the executive branch. So I do want to clarify that it's not unusual for staff to do a first draft, staff to seek input from whoever the drafting authority is and work forward to present a plan. This plan's being presented to the public. It's not being presented to the legislature for approval. Recall, this plan is being presented to the public as the state's plan. And the public, I just feel very strongly, needs to know who's drafting the plan and needs to know what all of the input of the council members were. So again, I think knowing why we need to switch from a staff drafted plan that we all react to and contribute to once it's on paper and identify the gaps, to a committee drafting a plan, again, I think would be helpful for the council, full council, to understand the before and the after.
Okay. Sue and then Chris.
Thanks for this conversation. I think it's important that we actually do have a clear shared path forward. And I think Secretary Young raised a really important question that I don't know the answer to, as compared to what was the plan. I feel like I've had the experience of being in the executive branch, where I think for the most part, the executive branch, when asked by the legislature to create a path forward or a document, tends to take responsibility for that and guide it and essentially own it. On the other hand, I'm thinking about the legislative process, and Rich's comment made me think about what it's like to be in the legislature, where you cede the work to staff, and then you have a process of engaging conversation around legislators. In this case, it could be the counselors of a subcommittee. So I have a sense that this proposal was to address a concern that the plan might not get written by the counselors or with, in the opinion of some, adequate influence or input. But rather than, imagine people from the council and staff writing it, maybe it's better to think about the process of review and engagement. And I think that the public records law stuff is really a problem. So I kind of like the idea of thinking about a process that we can buy into, that maybe doesn't assume that. I was kind of wondering about the beginning of the document, where it's like, oh, either a staff or a member of the council will take the lead of the writing. And I'm wondering why that, as opposed to, staff taking it on, but then a counselor engaging maybe in a more public way with the response. So I'm trying to understand why we've come to this proposal a little more.
Okay. Chris?
Yep. So let's wrap this up. I think that really where we're trying to get to is what Sue just described and what I described earlier. And, it was about, mutual support, with trying to support the administration staff in the drafting of it, having counselors involved so that things weren't just totally hung on the staff. And to Sue's point, really, I think what we're trying to get to is the process by which things are ultimately reviewed and approved. So it's feeling like the structure is not working. It's way more controversial than I ever imagined it would be. I, as one of the people who first brought this up, would be fine with just pulling it and having that other conversation about the review and engagement process. But Lauren want to know what your thinking is, since you were the other person recommending this process. Where you stand on it?
Yeah, I'm fine pulling it too.
Okay. So to be clear, what's come out of this conversation is there's interest in tapping the capacity and, willingness to work of counselors, right? Where that's helpful. There's a recognition this is a big lift for staff. And there's real concerns about creating some kind of committee. And that's why, Chris, you and Lauren are willing to pull this back right now to figure out how to do this in a way that isn't creating all this concern. Am I getting that right, Chris? I just want to make sure I'm hitting that right.
Yeah. The intent was, I like I said, I never imagined it would create this much controversy. I understand why it did. So yeah, I think we've highlighted through the conversation about the structure what some of the issues and concerns are among everybody involved. So let's move forward with that and figure out about the best means of engagement and review, and that we can have, given the structure that we've got to work with. And frankly, the very limited time that we have to work with.
Okay. All right, so Abby, I see your hand up. Do you want to help us round up this conversation?
I can try. Apologies for being late. I guess I did miss the beginning of this. I just want to say that I fundamentally am entirely confused by how there is an issue with counselors with expertise in planning offering their capacity to the process of planning, and how that is an issue. This is supposed to be a new type of a process. So again, apologies if I missed something while I was trying to get to a place where I had service, but
Yeah.
this, I guess if Lauren and Chris are fine with pulling it, but that's okay. But I also just want to say again on the public record that process-wise, this has been abhorrent. And I can't believe that this was talked about in July. And it's just now that we're getting to the point, and the counselors who brought this forward and built this out and took the time out of their schedules to do this, when at the same time we're being told that state staff doesn't have the capacity. I mean, Erica just wrote that in the chat. Something isn't making sense. And I guess if it's too controversial, it's too controversial, but I fundamentally am quite confused.
Yeah. So in the face of that confusion, it feels like what's being said here is yes to counselors, putting up their hand and offering to help. What seems to be causing confusion and or concern is a formalized process that could be in the end unwieldy. And I think if I'm understanding Chris and Lauren, you're saying, okay, if that's not working, let's pull that back. The offer still stands for counselors to help out and work and step in and help, right? But we can pull back this sort of specific recommendations because seems to be hitting a whole bunch of concerns. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, I don't know how much more time I can put into this, frankly. I'm happy to put time into reviewing drafts. I'm happy to put time into, if somebody wants me to help write something, I'm happy to do that. But we've been talking about this structure now for weeks. It was never intended to be this controversial, raised, I don't know, it seems to be all these subtexts. And I think let's learn from the issues raised here and go forward with whatever process works for everybody. I wish I had a perfect answer for the alternative. I don't, but this doesn't seem to. This seems to be bogging us down rather than help us move us forward.
Yeah. Okay. So to round out this point, what you all as a steering committee, if I understand, are saying is let's not push this forward to the full council because of the concerns expressed today. Let's talk to the full council about the process of counselor involvement and raising their hand and helping when they can in drafting, and fundamentally looking at reviewing and making sure that counselors are fully engaged in the content that's coming into this climate action plan. That's what I'm hearing. Is that for steering committee members, others? Is that what we're agreeing to here? Okay. Okay.
I mean,
all right.
I know that we're short on time, and I want to respect the direction that Chris and Lauren, and Leslie Ann as the drafters of this put forward. But and maybe I'm missing something, but I did not hear the concerns raised as to the level of therefore this needs to be pulled back. But I hear what Chris is saying is the amount of time and labor that might need to go into trying to find a way forward that addresses those concerns might be better spent just going with the original process and ensuring counselor engagement in the review process. But I feel like the intent of this proposal is really important, and I very much agree with it. That people who have the experience, expertise, willingness to help with drafting and review, this is a big task, and we have people with the ability and willingness to do that. We would be foolish not to engage that, especially from people like Chris and Lauren and Dr. Dupini-Giroux. So I know that we want to get to clarity and conclusion on this, but I'll just say from my perspective, it's not immediately clear that the concerns raised were asking for this to be pulled or necessitate the pulled back. But I also hear if Chris and Lauren are just saying it's not worth it at this point.
Lauren?
I'll also flag that this came to be as a climate action plan drafting task, and it was changed intentionally to development. If you actually look within each of the roles and responsibilities therein, there is actually nothing about explicit who's writing what, but identification of the process for how we determine who will be writing what. And if we do pull this, which I'm on board with Chris, and I can empathize entirely with the exhaustion I heard in your voice around this, I would still like to see a process outlined to the full council that does the things that are in each of the primary bullets, to include things like ensure incorporation of feedback and comments, both from the counselors and the public, to include identification of cross-cutting pathways and strategies, which I keep hearing is something that people within subcommittees want to see done, but they aren't sure the avenue from which that can be achieved. So this was, again, another potential idea that would allow there to be some cross-subcommittee collaboration. To Chris's point, I think it seems like there's just not the will to have this done, and that's completely fine. We can pull a proposal, but it does shine a light on the issues with the process to date, I think, pretty well.
Okay, Secretary Young, and then let's see if we have it in us to move into the next thing.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Sue. It's not so much, that we need to pull the proposal, but we need to have a discussion, about the review process and when are counselors going to engage, and are all counselors going to be encouraged to engage, or are we asking the full council to cede that engagement to those who have the capacity? I think there's just a discomfort with that. It may be excluding counselors where we think we are actually including, counselors. I'm concerned about that. And I don't think this forecloses anybody from reviewing a first draft and saying, this is terrible, it needs to be written. Here are my suggested rewrites, or even, a committee assigned to do that once we get a rough draft on the table. So I'm not saying in no way should anything that we are saying here be reflective of our desire to have full counselor engagement. And I think, we've seen some engage on minor issues, but we're not saying all engage. And I think we all have to engage at some point on the draft itself, once we figure out how to draft that first draft. And I really would love to have a little more conversation with Kaya about how this, maybe at the full council meeting, how this is blazing an important trail, but unfortunately the rest of the laws didn't catch up with it that we have to comply with. And they're a pain, I understand, but they're important, public records and transparency laws. But how this, I would love to understand how this model reduces the distance between the public and those who I wholeheartedly agree have put some pressure labor into this so far. That's important to recognize as well. So anyway, I think if we can maybe talk about lay out a process for the council and where the counselors are going to be asked to engage at next week's council meeting would be a very good place to start this discussion with a timeline so folks know what their commitments are.
Okay. So the action you've taken is to ask that in the next council meeting, we lay out clearly how this will work. We use the bullets of this document as the kinds of things that you all want to see happen. And we, however, this idea of a specific committee is what we're saying. It's just, we're kind of at the end of the road on that in terms of energy level of pushing it. Okay. That's a good segue into looking at next week's council meeting. We've kind of used up the time we're going to do talking about prioritization, which is a really important conversation. I'm not quite sure how we're going to reclaim that time and find another time soon. It's a very relevant conversation as all the subcommittees are moving into this. And so I'll just put out there as a possibility that you all may need to have a quick special conversation about that because this went so long. But I think we should pivot. My recommendation is pivoting into looking at the next week's meeting and to see if what we're talking about right now, how that would play out into the agenda for next week. Is that okay with folks if we do that, pivot and look at the next week's full council meeting agenda? So we make sure we look at that before we end today. Is that okay? Okay. Secretary Young?
It's fine by me. I see that our last agenda item is about development process and changing our meeting agendas. So if you're proposing that there be consensus to remove some items from the agenda, I think we should probably be very clear about that.
Yeah. I guess I need to ask you all then, is it okay if we find a time to talk about the prioritization piece that we want to talk about at a subsequent meeting, maybe a special one? I definitely don't want to proceed on that unless you all are okay with that.
What, speaking from a subcommittee co-chair that really needs guidance on prioritization, what would have to, if we kept this piece on the agenda, what else could come off of the agenda and be discussed at another time? Or is this the only thing that can really come off the agenda today and have to be discussed at another time? I just want to point out, we're looking at having to submit strategies and actions to the council a week before the next council meeting so that there's plenty of time to review because there's lots of material. It's not, there will be no prioritization process or action on guidance from the steering committee unless it comes out like today. Because we've got to incorporate that into the process that's taking place as we speak.
Okay. Yeah, I would love to find a way to do it too, whether we extend our meeting today or we set up a special meeting. The other things to deal with is just making sure the steering committee is okay with what's going to happen next week at the Climate Council. And there's some updates that can be done over email probably if we're really pushing stuff out. So that's what we got. We got a half hour. So we can try to do both. I just think we should just continue on. I think if folks want to do a fast path through prioritization, that's fine. We absolutely have to agree on what's going to happen at the next Climate Council meeting as well. Okay. This is my suggestion, folks. I think we should look at next week's agenda. Hopefully we can do that with some efficiency. We can flag up what we want to talk about in terms of prioritization. And you all as a group can decide if you want to do a special continuation of this, either in this meeting right now, continue it, or in another date, speaking to Erica's concerns that this is moving fast. That's what I recommend we do. Okay. Any concerns with doing that? I'm looking at steering committee members right now. Okay. So let's dive into this agenda. Let's see if we can do it somewhat efficiently. It is hyperlinked in today's agenda. If you want, I can put the actual, I can even share my screen as we talk about it. So for next week in the council meeting, what we're specifically doing, why don't I just go ahead and share my screen for a second? Just shout out if for whatever reason you can't see well what's there. When we start off next week and do our sort of just transitions moment, what we're going to do is ask the co-chairs to speak about how Just Transitions Committee, subcommittee, took in the feedback from the council and reacted to that. And they have drafted up a response to that they're going to share this week, and we can look at it all together in the meeting. And the idea is to be able to, what we didn't do formally last time, which is say, yep, you heard us, sounds good. Let's take these on as ours as a council. So that's the first thing we aim to do. And when the document's ready, it'll be attached to this agenda. The second piece we were going to do is around what we just discussed. So this is where we'll need to present here. And this is, I'll ask for your opinion here, folks, steering committee members and others. It sounds like what needs to be presented here is pathways for how counselors are going to be engaged in the drafting and reviewing process. And be clear about what that's going to look like and what those opportunities are. And also a mention of the fact that we attempted to do a different approach and we just ran into a lot of concerns on it and it was pulled back. Okay, so that's what we would do here. I don't know if it's going to need more than 15 minutes considering we just spent quite a bit of time on it. But our idea was to have that happen here. So counselors can see what their potential role is. The specific action will be different, obviously, than what's here in this draft agenda. This piece here is the prioritization piece we want to take a look at before we end this meeting. And if we need more time to find a time to look to do that. This is what we wanted to show and talk through with steering committee and co-chairs first. So that's a big chunk of this meeting, is to walking through exactly what we want to walk through with you all right now. Okay. And then with that in subcommittee, to have that subcommittee present specific recommendations around greenhouse gas accounting, and also come back to signal the pathway forward on the social cost of carbon and how to look at those sensitivity analysis of other discount rates that we talked about in our last meeting.
David, I think there's an issue there with the time, since those two items are both stamped 3:15.
Oh, yes. Okay, that's a time problem. And I think we have 45 minutes to do both. So hopefully that is enough time to do both. I don't know, Jared, if yours is going to need more than 25 minutes.
Jared's communicated with me that 30 minutes works for him for the first one, and then I've been working with Leslie Ann under the assumption that 15 minutes was all she wanted, or needed, I should say.
Great. So that's
that
just
should
an
be
error.
3:45.
Yeah, that's an error and a typo problem. Okay. And then finally, some updates on logistics and the meetings and some public engagement schedule updates, public comment, and adjourn. So that's what we got for next week. And let me just pause and say, any concerns or red flags about what we got going on planned for the council meeting next week? And tell me to scroll up or down depending on where you want me to be. Everybody okay with that? Yeah, I'm not seeing a ton of movement.
David, just to flag, I had a small language change that I put in the chat, but it sounds like Jane's already on it.
Got it. Okay, thanks. That's helpful. Okay.
Sue has her hand up. Yeah.
Yeah. Sue, go ahead, please.
Sorry, it's not a steering committee member, but just noting that if it might make sense to put this topic that we were just on higher up above the just transitions piece. And if we aren't able to fit in the just transitions piece, I have a suggestion that, we have drafted information we want everyone to read, and we could, as an alternative, spend time with the members of the council who had discomfort with certain elements, that we would invite them to our meeting, so we would have more of a discussion rather than having it at that council, just as a concept, if we needed time.
Okay.
That might be a different process.
Thanks, Sue. Okay. Okay. Did anyone feel strongly about what Sue suggests of either inverting those two just transitions in this conversation we've been having about how counselors are involved, and or doing the just transition thing in a slightly different way, talking to the folks who had specific concerns? And that sort of makes a much quicker piece on just transitions. Any feelings on that, folks? Okay. All right. So I just want to note that I'm sensing there's some reticence on engagement right now. I just want to check, are folks checked in this conversation? Do we want to be having this conversation, or folks want to be doing something else right now? Just want to make sure. And it's so hard to read in a Zoom room what's going on. Are folks okay with the agenda for next week? Is there anything else people need to say? Can we treat it as okay?
David, can you put the agenda back up one more time?
You bet.
I'll just hit.
And obviously, this piece will be changed to where we got to in our conversation today.
Lauren's name needs to be corrected under the 2 o'clock. But that's getting pulled anyway.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that, Lauren.
No, it's getting pulled anyway. So
Yeah.
Usually it's company, it gets misspelled company. So
Yeah, yeah. Okay. Anything else you want to see on this, Chris?
Just on the subcommittee, I know the guidance for subcommittees, just kind of following up on the comments that Gina just made, and the whole conversation we just had about the drafting. I'm just wondering if that does that bullet point describe enough of what needs to be discussed, as far as like what the subcommittees are expected to draft or not draft at this point.
And are you talking about this 215 piece around the guidance piece?
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is what we want to present right now and test some thoughts with you. There's a presentation that we put together that we want to test with you all, and then do it with the council next week. So it has a fair amount of detail in there.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you want to say on that, Chris?
No, I just, I guess I've heard in the background, just in being in different subcommittee meetings and just hearing a discussion, it seems to keep coming up, who's going to do the writing? How are we going to do the writing? And unless I'm hearing that wrong, I mean, Jared and Richard have both been in some of the meetings I've been. Sue has as well, and I'm just it seems like that's an issue that keeps coming up, and it seems like a pretty big question that keeps coming up. So,
Yeah.
but I may be misreading the room. Maybe the concerns aren't as widespread as my sense has been that they are. So I'll defer. And Jane's got insight into all of them, so I totally defer to what other folk think about that particular issue.
Yeah. I think part of this is just previous, and Jane, go ahead, but this is almost previous to writing. It's like getting the analysis done, right? The actual analysis that happens that gives you raw material to then put pen to paper in a more narrative way. Jane, you want to go ahead, and then Richard?
I was going to exactly say what you just did, David, but it also, Chris's comment sort of spawned interest for me to seek clarity on the agenda item above this, which is about drafting, and just sort of wanting to call attention to like clearly identifying what the bullets are for that based on our previous conversations. So we walk away today understanding who's doing what for the council meeting and the actual components of that conversation, because I think I have it, but I'd just like to make sure we're all in agreement on what those are around a cap drafting process or not, and then a proposal from Marion and I together around a timeline and the outline and the draft, and then a conversation about the various components.
Got it. So,
because this feels like it's now in our lap, but I want to make sure I see that correctly and understand the role of counselors also in that process.
right. So for the 2 p.m. section up here, what we got to, in my understanding of the conversation, was it is in your lap, Jane, to make a presentation about how counselors, how that drafting process may unfold and the role of counselors in those different pieces, and to pull from the bullets that are in this document, right, that's been prepared, and the piece that's not being put forward, as I understood it from Chris and Lauren, is this specific recommendation of we have this committee that's doing it, right? There's still ample opportunity for involvement in the different pieces of the puzzle. What's not being put forward is therefore it's a committee of folks.
Yeah, David, if it's helpful, just for me to explain to folks, like the pulling of the proposal is that going to the full council without a clear endorsement from the steering committee probably would have resulted in a really chaotic council discussion, probably with no outcome. And so this would have just continued that kind of conversation, but to no productive end. And so, and I wouldn't see us on a clear pathway within the steering committee to get to an endorsement of not just that proposal, but wasn't exactly sure where we might be able to get to. And I didn't want to take up any more, so was concerned about taking up more time. So I think we can probably get to a good place now that we've, I think, since that proposal is off the table, which I guess it is, unless the steering committee wants to vote to move it or something else forward. Just have staff come back with a proposal about what that drafting process looks like, and how they're going to get drafts. I would just encourage staff and the secretary and the administration to to get those drafts and pieces and parts to counselors as soon as possible, just to get their input, and whatever that process looks like to do that. And I'm sure that they can come up with a good proposal for that.
Thanks, Richard.
Well, I think Chris said it very well just now. I'm looking forward to a proposal that recognizes the concerns that were raised, and I think it's quite doable. The one part of the document that I think we don't have a process for at this point is the possible intersection between committees, where trying to somehow find time. I don't know if we do have time, but it would be important to do it if we could, to ensure cross-fertilization across the committees, because there are plenty of possible strategies and actions that would be appropriate for inclusion because they have multiple benefits, both for mitigation and for resilience, for example. And I don't know that we have a process for actually uncovering and figuring out how to be really smart about those. Maybe that's something we have to do later, but that was touched on in Lauren's comments, and I just want to acknowledge that we haven't really solved it.
Thanks, Richard. Okay. So is there anything else we want to say for the mandate of what we're asking Jane and staff to put together for that section on next week? Anything else that hasn't been said? Okay. So for that agenda next week, any other concerns folks have or things we want to change? Okay, I'm not seeing any. So why don't we do this? We've got 10 minutes left in our meeting time. It seems to me that we want to give a preview, a window into what we're talking about in terms of this guidance for subcommittees. And so 10 minutes is not enough time to do it. And I'm going to recommend we give a preview of it, and we find a time for folks to circle back with this, maybe even later in the week, and we could record it so people who can't be there can look at it. And that would be my recommendation. I'll leave it to you all as a steering committee to suggest something else or confirm that recommendation, but I think we should do a preview now, and then schedule up a time for us to dig into this before the council meeting, and record that if anybody else wants to look at it. But let me just test that with folks. I know, Erica, you're very interested to have this conversation. I think all subcommittees are. So does that seem reasonable for us to do a preview of that and then find another time to get into more depth? Jane?
Well, yes, I support that generally if that's the way the steering committee wants to go. I just recognize that to get to the place of the presentation that we have to share took us substantial amount of time. And so to go through it in under 10 minutes is actually a lot to ask right now, I think. Mm-hmm. And I just wonder if there's, I wonder how productive that would be, and ask if there's, because we thought about it as a standalone document, which is why there's so much word text on it, if there would be more value in having steering committee members and or counselors reviewing it independently and sending feedback directly to myself and or Marianne in order to compile and learn from for the council meeting next week. Happy to run through it, but it's going to feel very shortchanged and a lot to process in a short period of time.
Yeah. Secretary Moore?
I just wondered if we could maybe go around with the 6 steering committee members and see if folks have the ability to hang on the line for an extra 15 or 30 minutes now. Appreciating the timeliness of this conversation and the challenge I think we're going to have finding another time to have it.
Yeah. Let's do it, folks. Does anybody not have 20 minutes more to put into this right now to stay on past our normal time? Is that going to be impossible for any steering committee members here that are joining us? See Chris saying he's okay with it. Jared's okay with it. Secretary Young. I'm just trying to look.
Also, all right.
All right. Okay. So let's do that.
Actually, that might be, David, that might be hard for me. And I actually really appreciate Jane's comment that we do need to really have the time to go through it. And I wonder if not all of us kind of each as individual steering committee members, but also opening this up to the full council for review, and digital feedback to Jane between now and the meeting on Tuesday makes sense.
Okay. Would it be helpful, Lauren, if we walk through it over the next half hour and you stay as long as you can and we record it and then send you back the recording? You can catch the last 15 minutes. And we also still do the written input.
Yeah, that's fine.
Is that all right? Okay. So why don't we do this until 10 of the hour, 10 before 5? And if folks have to drop off, we do have the recording and we'll make sure that that gets sent around in a timely way. And certainly the idea of soliciting written input is a great one ahead of the meeting. So it gets people's heads in thinking about it. Okay, so let's do that. So Jane, you have more than 10 minutes. Let's go ahead and take a look at that presentation and what's behind it. And so Jane, I'll turn it over to you to do that.
Okay, thanks everyone. This all feeds into the conversation that we've been having today, and also recognizes the moment that we're at right now with subcommittees in identifying and putting forward action items as will be presented to the council over the course of the next month. First and foremost with rural resilience and ag and ecosystems on September 28th, and then cross-sectors focus of their meeting on October 5th with the council. So there's been an interest and a recognition of the need to support and prioritize the action items coming up into the climate action plan. And in support of that process, Marion, myself, David, as well as other CBI facilitators and counselors through conversations have been helping us think about how to do this, recognizing the capacity that we're under with respect to the timeline. So a couple of weeks ago now, probably more than that, a couple of months ago, we've started to use the idea of foundational criteria. And we've been building these ideas and these boxes off of the components of the Global Warming Solutions Act and the language in which it speaks to. So the recognition that in order to elevate and think about strategies and ultimately the actions needed to operationalize those strategies, we want to elevate not only justice and equity, but also ideas that have co-benefits, cost effectiveness, have impact progress towards the GWSA or requirements and goals, the goals that ag and ecosystems and rural resilience are also working on, and of course, put forward ideas that are technically feasible. So just a reminder of where we are in the process. The council got a sneak peek in July of pathways and strategies, but subcommittees have been working hard to refine those and consolidate and build towards a final list of pathways and strategies. The way the current climate action plan is drafted, all of those pathways and strategies will be put forward in the body of the plan for inclusion. There will be no need to prioritize pathways and strategies. All of those will be included as front and center for ideas. There's still a recognition that to capture and bring an audience forward, the audience being all the stakeholders involved in implementing the climate action plan, that yet less is more. So right now, subcommittees are working really hard to consolidate and think about their priorities with respect to not only pathways and strategies, but also as we move into action development. So actions being operational tasks that we have not heard from yet from subcommittees. The recognition that the work that we heard from in July was these broader buckets, and now we're getting at how we're going to implement the work. So we want to distinguish those that are ready for implementation and those that require further development, and that the focus of this first CAP and the focus of where we're going to prioritize in our mind, put forward for you all to consider, is around those actions that are ready to implement. And so the next few slides will sort of get us through what we mean by that, or what could be considered for what we mean by that. So just a reminder, in the body of the climate action plan, the way that this is structured in the outline right now is pathways, and those pathways are bucketed by those stools for those three-legged components of what we need for climate policy around resilience, around resilience and adaptation, around sequestration, and then mitigation. So all those pathways needed to bring forward action in that body will be listed. The strategies will then be underneath the pathway. And then again, further prioritization and consolidation of actions under each strategy, with the idea being that actions that are ready for implementation will all be listed, and this consolidated assessment of action, the prioritization, will be done on the actions that are ready for implementation, but the actions needing further development will still be in the body of the plan, but simply listed, and that extra layer of prioritization and thought process, the transparency around how the decisions are being made, won't be included in the body of the plan. That time won't be spent there on those actions. Let me move I can't actually see my screen well. So what we wanted to propose for you all today is the process that, one, we actually are seeing unfold within subcommittees, but then put a finer point on it on how we're going to speak to those five foundational criteria. So right now, the work that is happening at the subcommittees where these where strategies and actions are being refined and developed, that consolidation process has begun, where expert judgment is being used to consolidate the ideas. Think about where you have duplicate strategies. Think about the primary pathway or the primary strategy where things belong. And Marion has been really helpful in helping build templates to support subcommittees in doing that work. And that is work that is being carried on without, hopefully, the need of the council around direction for prioritization. Underneath those, though, and as you sort through what are strategies versus actions, there's a need to think about, again, using expert judgment and the guidance of the subcommittees. What are the strategies that are ready for immediate implementation versus further development? Where one of the things we hope to get to today with the steering committee and then ultimately with the council is how we define what's ready for immediate implementation versus what further development, which ones need further development. So we tried to articulate clear and concise language around that to give guidance, recognizing that something that's ready has a realistic path to implement in the near term. That means that it has a programmatic framework, there's an authority who can work towards it, and it likely has funding associated with it. And implement means that we've identified who is going to carry that specific action forward. So that's what we're thinking about, really that broad bucket of what's ready to implement and how subcommittees can use that as they sort through the action items that they have as a list right now, and where they have ideas that are needed for further development for future iterations of climate action planning, recognizing that those will still be listed in the body, but we won't have to do this further analysis on. So the idea being, again, that you would focus then your analysis around the five foundational criteria, agreeing that assuming that we accept what those five foundational criteria are and the definitions associated with them, and that we'll work through a transparent process to evaluate strategies and actions against those criteria. So almost always this will be using expert judgment. Some of the criteria specifically associated with cross-sector for mitigation will have a specific detailed analysis behind it, but most of this will be using expert judgment at the subcommittee level to elevate actions that are ready. So most will use a high, medium, and low ranking in order to move things through a process faster, but ensuring a conversation has ensued, and that will use this analysis to then further reinforce what actions are ready to focus on and what might actually still need further development. The idea being then in the climate action plan, recognizing that less is more sort of foundational component, that you would speak to a package of actions that are ready for implementation taken together that address the five foundational criteria. Again, that's sort of hard to flesh out and really see in detail if we're not looking at the CAP draft too. So as we think about how to do this well with the full council, it will be great to get feedback on how we build an expectation around how we clearly articulate what we mean here. But then we'd refine actions that are ready, again, based on that criteria, and which ones need further development based on the criteria assessment. So the suggested process really is that what I just spoke to, those five components: consolidation, that sorting of actions based on professional judgment that are ready to implement, and then that focused analysis on the five criteria using that transparent process around and agreed upon definitions for the 5 criteria and likely a high, medium, and low ranking. And then again, consolidated analysis presented by the strategy level for a package of actions under each strategy. So the question sort of for all of you today, if we're able to get to, is, does this feel right? Are we headed in the right direction for the December 1st project? Recognizing that a lot of professional judgment will be used to sort pathways and strategies from the onset, and those actions that we want to do that further analysis on, speaking to the foundational criteria. Does the whole process for subcommittees feel clear and appropriate, and how can we do this better? So analysis will be at the action level, presented by strategy on a consolidated group of actions. There's expert judgment, mainly a high, medium, and low framework, although for equity as well as technical feasibility, there'll be a little bit of a different process that you'll see on the next slide, but largely it'll be high, medium, and low. This doesn't leave space or time to weight individual criteria, and that's something that I know some people have wanted to see, so would love to sort of recognize if we all support the idea of not weighting specific to criteria. It's really allowing a transparent space to speak to all of them, but not necessarily giving preference to one criteria over another. And then of course, in the mitigation space, we'll also make sure that those actions ready for immediate implementation need to meet the statutory emission reduction goal. And there's a separate component in the CAP outline where we get to that cumulative assessment. So what we had hoped to do was agree on the generic nature of the process, refine the work where we needed to in order to provide more clarity to subcommittees, think about how we do that, and then work with the steering committee to see if we could reach consensus around definitions for each criteria, which we have on the next slide. But I think I'm going to pause here, see how this feels right now, and if we want to turn our attention to the definitions or leave that for the council.
Thanks, Jane. Okay, so that is a lot to take in.
Yeah.
I think let's jump in. Erica and then Jared.
Just a piece of clarification, Jane. This analysis, when is it intended for the analysis to happen? Is it before the end of September Climate Council meeting, or is it after that, like immediately after that?
We've been thinking about for this month, the intent is to consolidate your pathways, strategies, and actions, which is what you're all doing right now. And then the first step in this process, which is the sorting of actions that are ready to implement, the hope and expectation is we'd be able to get to that point by the end of the month, reach consensus around those that are ready to implement, and then work over the course of the next few weeks before you come back to the council, based right now on the timeline at the end of October, to work through the analysis of the prioritization.
Okay, thanks. And then one other piece of clarification. We would be basically scoring our actions based on those 5 criteria, high, medium, low for each criteria. So
yeah, except for this, the next slide, which shows we have high, medium, and low for co-benefit impact on progress towards GWSA requirements or goals. And then for equity, you would apply the scoring rubric that we have. And then for technical feasibility, it would simply be a yes and no answer based on the definition. So
thanks.
Jared?
First, I just want to, it's clear that a lot of careful thought and work went into this. And I think overall, this looks like a great proposal, and I really appreciate it. I do want to flag that I think one of the things that's we're talking about definitional clarity, right? I think one of the things that's really important to have a shared understanding, shared definition for, even if we can't get to it right now, because I could imagine it getting, there's number of things that if we don't have that shared clarity, things could get messy. But I think one of them is actions that are ready to implement. I think there are a lot of things that are, technically feasible, a lot of things that the analysis has done, but there will be different political considerations around ready to implement. I think part of my concern about how that gets interpreted is allayed by Jane saying, that meeting the requirements isn't kind of up for conversation. It's not part of the criteria. It's threshold and it's foundational. We need to put. I mean, there are many things we need to do with this plan, but I think the most important is that we meet the legal requirements that were set forth in the GWSA, including ensuring that the pathway strategies and actions add up to meeting the 2025 and 2030 emissions reduction requirements, among other pieces. But that is the clearest and the first listed that I think is a threshold foundational thing that we need to do. And so I think we're going to need to have, in order to do that, I think we're going to need to have an expansive definition of ready to implement, rather than a narrow definition of ready to implement. And we will also need to identify strategies and actions that require further research, and may need to be more fleshed out in the intervening 4, 6 months, year, whatever. There may need to be some placeholders around actions that we know are likely going to be necessary, but may need further development to actually move forward. I think the main thing I'm trying to say is, regardless of someone's political consideration about ready to implement, we do need to make sure that the plan and the actions put forth, that we have a high degree of confidence that can be objectively assessed, add up to meeting the requirements.
Thanks, Jared. Yeah, and I think this is one of these things that, it never hurts to say it a million times, but it is said throughout, and it will be said again, that the actions ready to implement for mitigation, emissions reductions, the package that goes forward has to, put, as you say, credibly put Vermont on the path to meet its statutory goals. Like, that is a basis of the work here. Okay, Rich?
Thank you. And the fact that it might take legislative action in order to adopt a strategy or an action doesn't preclude it from being ready to be presented to the legislature.
Correct. Ready to implement includes things that need legislative action. It's ready for the legislature to take that action, right? That's part of it, right? Ready for the legislature to take action, ready for the administration to take action, ready to go, find some other implementation step, right? Thanks, Rich. Are there other questions that folks have about this? Things that aren't really landing clearly or well? Okay. And for any co-chairs that are left on the call, folks, is this feeling like a clear enough pathway for the steps that will happen over the next weeks, a month, 2? Okay. So we're going to present this again at the council level. And I think what I just heard in terms of ways to improve this, Jared's comment of ready to implement needs to add up to the statutory requirements on emissions reductions, therefore probably needs to have a fairly expansive definition. And we do intend it to mean, ready for the legislature to take legislative action, et cetera. What else? Chris?
Jane just put in the chat, do we want to see the last slide? I'd suggest we look at the last.
Yes, let's definitely see.
Because one of my concerns, it's not a concern. We've got to tackle this. But on the equity conversation, we just had a whole subcommittee discuss that for weeks, and define what equity was. Impact, I think, is the reason I was asking in the chat is that I went back and looked myself too at Jane's. We don't have guidance on what cost effectiveness means. And I could just see that itself, unless did science and data define that based on a literature review or anything about a working definition of cost effectiveness?
Yeah. So why don't we walk through this slide, Jane? Maybe you can give a sense of, like, as far as you got or we got in putting some draft definitions down, and see if this is hitting the level of detail or whether we're going to need to go further.
Yes, thank you for that. And yeah, I think that, you know, in relation to how we do the definitions for this is a really good question around process. We did our best in using the GWSA and other language and tools that have already been developed, such as the equity, the application of the scoring rubric, to put a process together here. But I welcome ideas and conversation around how to make these more, you know, clearer than they are and engaged with the subcommittees in a way that makes sense. So progress towards GWSA requirements and goals really speaks to the impact of the action item. And so we tried our best to relate it with respect to the timeframes that we have around the mitigation targets in particular, but we thought of consideration of actions contribution to achieving 2025, 2030, 2050 emission reduction requirements and/or resiliency, adaptation, and sequestration goals. This is one in particular where we have high, medium, and low, but specific for cross-sector. They'll have real data here that will inform how they rank something. It's also really tied into how we thought about cost effectiveness, in a recognition that for cost effective can mean many different things, but in this way we suggested that how cost effective something is speaks to its impact towards the progress towards the GWSA requirements and council goals relative to the cost. And so again, high, medium, and low. The equity speaks component here, since it was on the agenda and we didn't get to it for an update, the hope and capacity is that we have selected a contractor to work towards supporting the work of the subcommittees and then ultimately in the council in the application of the scoring rubric. So our hope is that that person, as we bring them on board, will be able to give some clarity around that application and hopefully support to the subcommittees to do so. Again, technical feasibility and co-benefits perhaps might be the most straightforward here, but technical feasibility is, we really have narrowly defined it to technical feasibility here, recognizing that the cost is another one and that's draw it out in the cost effectiveness component. So really just around, is this strategy and/or action able to be advanced now, yes or no? And then co-benefits, really speaking to the ability of an action to meet multiple goals or targets within the language of the GWSA, recognizing that resilience speaks to things beyond, including public health and other measures of resilience. So we kept this pretty, this took a lot of time to think about how to write these, but also tried to keep them really attainable for subcommittees to be able to speak to quickly and succinctly as they run through their actions.
Thanks, Jane. Okay, we're getting towards the end here. We do have a second. If anybody wants to weigh in on these definitions and anything we want to change ahead of sharing this with the full council. Anything that's jumping out at folks? Okay. Okay. We're kind of at the end of the road here for this. Anything else folks want to share as they're hearing Jane talk about this? I was just looking at the chat here, sorry.
I would just really encourage folks that this is a lot, and I would encourage folks to look through the slides, and I would welcome one-on-one conversations or written feedback between now and the end of the week so that we can work to revise this to reflect everybody's thoughts for next week.
Jared?
I hope this is helpful, but at the risk of stating the obvious, I'll just note that I can imagine that it feels to me like a number of these actions are going to have a lot of detail associated with them in order to assess the proposed action on these criteria. Because a number of actions that get generally talked about could score high or low on these criteria, depending on the final design of a regulation, a policy, an incentive. So, for instance, it would not be enough to just say, I don't want to think of specific examples off the top of my head. I just want to flag that for a number of these proposed actions, in order to actually assess them, there's going to likely need to be a fair level of detail, or we'll have to frame them broadly and say the degree to which they are cost effective or advanced equity will depend on the final design of legislators, of the administration, of the rulemaking process. But in order to make sure that they do score high on these criteria, we recommend that X, Y, Z are prioritized. I'm just trying to flag that there's a limited ability of this council to draft legislation, to write rules, to finalize programs where, at the end of the day, though, whether and to what extent these criteria are met will be in the details of the design of each of those.
Jared, the way you put it makes so much sense to me and how we've been talking about this. It is as a initial climate action plan. In some cases, you might have enough detail to really get good answers. In other cases, you're going to be giving indications of how this becomes more cost effective, more equity, more equitable and just, et cetera. And that's okay, right? You'll just have to give that indication. Okay, we're at 10 of, which is the time that I said we would stop. I want to make sure we leave some time for public comment for anyone who's been courageous and hanging in with us to the end here to do public comment. But I think, Jane, what I'm hearing is, maybe a few modifications before you send it out, but really this needs to go out and we can attach it to the agenda. And if there's some changes that we're going to suggest ahead of Monday, we can consolidate those and present it to the council and say, we've heard your feedback and these are the ways we would change it. In fact, here's a new version. Sounds good? Okay. Thanks everybody for hanging in on that. It's really crucial as we get going here. I do want to take this pause now for public comment and say anybody who's been listening in, participating in this conversation today, if there's something you want to say, let's take some time to do that. And make an opportunity for that right now. So go ahead and raise your hand. Chase, I see your hands up. Thanks for sticking with us today. Go ahead, Chase, please.
Thanks for everybody for all of your hard work. You certainly covered a lot of things today. And so I just wanted to express my appreciation and gratitude for that. I have a couple of comments sort of working in reverse of the order in which they were raised. Starting with the prioritization document that was just discussed, and then talking about the drafting process. So on the prioritization document, I noted the pro tip that talks about sort of long lists. It says long lists of ideas run the risk of losing the attention and focus of implementers. And I fully understand the sentiment there that there's a lot to do and there's going to be a lot to be implemented, and that there are considerations there. I guess what I would suggest in this comment is that rather than potentially thinking of prioritization as an either or kind of paradigm in which very high level things are sort of put onto the list of things we're going to do, and the medium and lower priority things kind of get lopped off in service of having a short list. Rather than doing something like that, to the extent that's something that might occur, sequencing could be a much more beneficial way of prioritizing different pathways and strategies. And I think if you look at the Global Warming Solutions Act, the fact that it has requirements that start kicking in pretty much right away to meet the 2025 goals, then 2030, and eventually 2050, the GWSA contemplates that sort of sequence of pathways and priorities. It's built into the system that this is going to be an ongoing process with perhaps higher priority things that occur right now, and then other things that can occur in 2025, 2023, or 2026, 2030, and so on. So I just suggest that maybe framing it as sequencing rather than sort of prioritizing based on a tiered model could be useful. And I don't have too much else to add to what Jared put in the comments in responding to the cost effectiveness, where he mentioned both the social cost of greenhouse gases and the cost per ton of greenhouse gases avoided. I appreciate that comment and clarification. I guess I would just add that to the extent that cost of per ton greenhouse gas emissions avoided could look at both the gross, current sector-based inventory that we've long been using, which is a really wonderful and important tool, but also, and noting this hasn't yet been done, but it's in process, but also look to the supplemental life cycle or upstream accounting as well, to actually assess what our true greenhouse gases are. As we all know, Section 570A says we have to, because it incorporates Section 582G, which requires life cycle accounting and ties it to the greenhouse gas emission reduction requirements. So that was the prioritization comment. On the drafting process, the second comment I wanted to make, I've done a pretty careful review of the GWSA, and it seems pretty clear to me that the plain language of the GWSA talks about preparing the plan, and that's a quote, preparing the plan, and it puts that, it's in section 591C, in case anyone wants to take a look at that. It says that the council and the subcommittees are going to be the ones responsible for preparing the plan. And you can look at other sections of the law too that talk about the council shall, identify and analyze. The council, shall develop and update the plan and all that sort of language naming the council. And I guess I just wanted to point to a comment that Rich made and a comment that Gina made, where they noted the subcommittees could be the locus of where a lot of the drafting could occur, and then it could filter upward. I just wanted to sort of highlight those comments because I think that they are sound expressions of what the GWSA speaks about, that the council and the subcommittees are going to be the folks drafting the plan. And that's not to say, of course, that there shouldn't be input from staff. Of course, members of the administration are part of the council and the subcommittees, and they bring so much to bear through their own staff members' expertise. But just wanted to point to the fact that that's the language of the GWSA. And I think, it makes sense. I wanted to point out something that Iris put in the chat, that it's really important to have diverse and different ideas put forward. And really, that's, I think, the entire intent behind the GWSA, why there are 23 members, why the legislature chose 23 members, because each of you have your own areas of expertise, and the legislature recognized that and wanted to bring you all together, the members of the Climate Council, for the purpose of creating an informed and insightful and wise climate action plan. And so, Jared, I think I'm paraphrasing what you said, so excuse me if I get it wrong, but I think it would be a shame if the folks with expertise who showed up and raised their hands to engage in this process, didn't have, a voice in the drafting process itself. Here's the very last thing I'll say. Please excuse me, it was a long meeting and I've been saving all this up, taking notes, but I just wanted to respectfully respond to something that Secretary Young mentioned, that many legislative acts refer to the secretary as the person who's going to be of an agency, as the person who's going to be responsible for writing a regulation or a rule. And that is totally true. And I totally get that. I just wanted to respectfully point out that the law typically talks about the secretary as being the entire agency. And that includes the staff in the agency. And here the legislature defined the council as the 23 members, and said that the council and the subcommittees are going to be the folks who are drafting the plan. And so just wanted to note that there is a bit of a difference between sort of the normal rulemaking way that the legislature does it with agencies and what they've done here, where they've been pretty clear, I think, that councilor input's important, and really that's what the legislature intended from the beginning. So thank you all for your hard work. Thanks for making an opportunity for me to comment and sticking with me through that long comment. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Chase. Really appreciate it. Okay. Helpful comments. Anything else, folks, members of the public who are with us? Want to make sure we give space for that. Okay. Great. Thanks, everybody. I think that's the end. Let's, in terms of next steps, expect, we're going to ask for your written input as well, or call Jane, schedule a conversation to talk in more detail through the prioritization. Same thing with what we're developing for the council around the issue of councilor involvement, drafting and review of the plan. All right. We welcome that sort of one-on-one conversation to get things right. Anything else, folks, before we sign off? Okay. I think that's it, folks. Thanks for hanging in there. Tough meeting, good meeting. We're making progress. We're getting right into the thick of it. We'll see you at the council meeting next week, if not before, individually. All right, everybody, take care. Have a good afternoon.
Have a good evening.
Yeah, bye-bye.